Today I want to tell you a story, and it starts with a passage from Homer's Iliad. It's the first one we ever did. Back in episode 1, we read the Iliad of Homer. Remember, this is an epic poem, and it's a passage from book 20, and this is Poseidon, the god of the sea and of earthquakes, speaking. Poseidon says, "Now I tell you, my heart aches for great Aeneas. He'll go down to the house of death this instant, overwhelmed by Achilles, all because he trusted the distant deadly archer's urgings. Poor fool, as if Apollo would lift a hand to save him now from death, grim death. Aeneas, the innocent. Why should Aeneas suffer here? For no good reason, embroiled in the quarrels of others, not his own. He always gave us gifts to warm our hearts, gifts for the gods who rule the vaulting skies. So come, let us rescue him from death ourselves, for fear the son of Cronus might just tower in rage if Achilles kills this man. He is destined to survive. Yes, so the generation of Dardanus will not perish, obliterated without an heir, without a trace. Dardanus, dearest to Zeus of all the sons that mortal women brought to birth for father. Now he has come to hate the generation of Priam, and now Aeneas will rule the men of Troy in power, his sons' sons, and the sons born in future years." So this is the story of Aeneas, and this passage and the Iliad itself is basically the oldest set of stories that we have about Aeneas, because of course this is the first work of Greek literature that comes down to us. And today, the story that I want to tell isn't just the story of how Aeneas founded Rome in the great myths. He's the mythical founder of the civilization that would eventually become Rome. And I want to tell that story, but I also want to tell the story about how this kind of B-list character in the Iliad became the official great founder of the Roman state and the Roman Empire. It's a really interesting story. It's about literature and politics and history and how these things all kind of come together and what they mean, what it means for today. The thing that I want to draw out of this that we'll get to as we go is for our present moment is that the way you think about your founding, your distant past, the first moment that your nation was formed, the way you think about that and the stories you tell about it are central to the way the present is going to go. You have to respect and love your founding or your nation is going to fall apart. That's the argument that I'm going to make, but I'm also going to tell you the story of Aeneas and how he became the founder of Rome. Basically, the point of all this is the 1619 Project, right? You guys know, I've talked about this before on the podcast. This is this New York Times extravaganza. I mean, at this point, it's not even just a series of essays. It's a curriculum that they teach in schools. It's been awarded the Pulitzer Prize. The founder of it, or kind of the architect of it, Nicole Hannah-Jones, has become this major public figure. And the whole point of the 1619 Project is that our founding, America's founding, was not just flawed, but sort of evil in itself, that racism runs in the DNA of America. And the way that Hannah-Jones does this is crucial, and people don't pay enough attention to it, is not by telling you facts about history, because she doesn't know any facts about history. Her own fact checkers have come out and said that that the 1619 Project is deeply flawed historically. But what she is a master storyteller. She's an artist. She's an artist of the founding, and she's trying to take the stories that we tell. She said this explicitly: the stories that we tell about our founding fathers, about the pilgrims who came to this country originally, and then the founding fathers themselves who rebelled against England and created our Constitution. Those people, she's trying to portray them not as virtuous heroes, as kind of actors within this providential story, but as rapists and slavers and liars and thieves. That's kind of the whole point of the 1619 Project. And it's at the root of why we're at each other's throats right now, why there are these riots in the streets, why people fear civil unrest so much. It's because we're being taught to hate the story of the founding. We're being told a false story that teaches us to hate the present America as it is now, because the way that you think about the origins of a thing shapes entirely the way that you think about the thing now. And so we can get into this story about Rome by thinking, first of all, about our own problems with our founding and thinking about just what the founding of a nation means to the people currently living in the nation. Because if the very beginnings of the thing that you're doing are wrong, then no matter how far you travel from them, it's always just going to be growing out of evil, basically. But if the beginnings are good and true, then you can look back at the founding and say, yes, this is us. And this Aeneas became that guy for the Romans. He became the person that they would point to and say, this is the very, very first seed out of which sprang the entire tree of our greatness. And so in order to understand the Aeneid, and people don't maybe get this when they first come to this text, they think, well, it's just a big poem, kind of like the Iliad, it's an epic poem. It's in Latin rather than Greek, but, it has a lot of similarities to Homer. It kind of calls back to Homer. But what people don't maybe get at first before they start cracking the spine of this thing is that you have to understand where Rome was when this poem was composed. So let's back up and talk about what we know about Roman history already from this show and kind of catch ourselves up to the moment when the Aeneid was composed. This is a poem, by the way, I'll note, by Publius Vergilius or Vergilius Maro, or Virgil, obviously, right? Virgil's Aeneid, I'm sure you've heard about it. It's one of the big ones, right? And so let's kind of think back now to kind of where we left Rome when we talked about the Gracchi and the Battle of Actium. You may remember, or you may not, maybe you haven't listened to these episodes. I recommend them. But if not, let me just recap, right? So the Gracchi, we had this story in the 130s and 120s BC. Rome had these populist uprisings based on the fact of a number of things, that their territory had expanded, but the middle class had languished, right? That the sort of Senate and the patricians and these very, very wealthy people had become decadent, had stopped caring about the vigor of Rome, and instead had been importing foreign labor and basically letting slaves work the lands that the middle class should have been able to own. And so it's very similar to our period. We have this class of self-serving elites that kind of, they hog up all the power and all the land. And then you have this huge tension of just simmering kind of angst from people that feel they've been cheated out of their birthright. And this is kind of, when people start to rally behind things like UBIs, universal basic incomes, because they feel like they don't have anywhere to go. And all these people come out and, this is where you get demagogues and populist leaders, is that they come forth and they basically say, all of this anger that you're feeling, I can harness it and I can lead this uprising. And a crucial thing to remember about that kind of moment, which is our kind of moment, as well as the Roman moment of 133 BC, the crucial thing to remember is that energy can actually be directed in a million different ways, some good, some bad, some kind of in between, right? Because it's not actually in itself a virtuous or an evil energy. It's just a response to what's going on, which is this kind of decay into oligarchy, this decay into the people who are supposed to be the elites, who are supposed to kind of genuinely have merit and rise to the top of society because they are, extremely wise or extremely cunning and powerful, or these virtues that they're supposed to have, these abilities to lead, become just kind of naked power. They become power without justification. And so when that happens, you get a ton, people get pissed, right? And that's what was going on in this moment. And everybody was kind of competing to lead that energy toward for their own movement. Just like right now, Bernie Sanders wants to lead all of the popular unrest, just as Donald Trump actually is offering something that he hopes can answer the popular anguish about immigration and globalism and shipping jobs overseas, all that stuff, right? This kind of shrinking middle class. Everybody's competing to lead that. And this was happening in Rome too. And so you had these two brothers, Tiberius and Sempronius Gracchus. And, I've told this story at length already, so I won't go too deeply into it here, but he basically starts, these brothers start offering things a lot like the UBI, these grain rations to just give people the food that they've been denied. And because of elite fear of that populist energy, Tiberius Gracchus is killed. He dies in 133 BC, killed by the elites, by the Senate, led by the Pontifex Maximus. And then Gaius, his younger brother, is forced to commit suicide in 121. So, but between, those years, 131 to 121, Rome's sort of simmering tensions erupt into just the worst of the worst. And after that, like shit went down. So this is when there was 100 years of violent turmoil that are known to Roman historians as being, some of the darkest times in Rome's history, and also some of the times that, they were the beginning of the end. 133 was the beginning of the end. It was like this moment when you kind of lit this spark, and then you couldn't control all of this energy. Once brother starts fighting against brother, then your civilization has really lost the glue that holds it together. The civic friendship is what you might call it between citizens has dissolved. And so there were a number of wars that followed the Gracchi. So now we're getting into new territory that we've never covered before, and we're going to kind of come back to some of this later. But just to recap, so that we know, or rather to summarize, so that we know. Going in, right, there was the social war from 91 to 87 BC, and this was a war over whether the Italian tribes who were allies of Rome, but not yet citizens, whether they were going to get citizenship. So those allies were called socii in Latin. It means sort of companions or allies in battle and also in sort of civilization building. And so they demanded citizenship, and that was a terribly bloody war over that. Rome basically denied them citizenship, and then they just fought this incredibly expensive war in terms of blood and treasure and toil. And again, we're going to come back to all this in another episode. But so that occurs, right? And then there followed these power struggles between kind of major military statesmen. You have one very famous one is Sulla, Lucus Cornelius Sulla Felix. There's a name to conjure with, right? He's this general and statesman. And then his kind of old commander, Marius, or Gaius Marius, basically they enter into a power struggle that becomes the first really full-blown civil war in Rome. And so when Sulla wins, which is, it sort of initiates this dictatorship between 82 and 79 BC. Rome has an office of the dictator in times of crisis. They hadn't used it since the Second Punic War, since the Second War against Carthage. But they are now basically thrown into this period where in times of crisis, they basically appoint a guy and say, all right, the state is in your hands, fix things, and then give the power back to the Republican system. So that's how that whole thing was supposed to work. But in fact, what ensued was what's called proscriptions. Now, Sulla basically just decided he was going to purge his political enemies. And this had happened before. Marius had already kind of done political executions, and so this was starting now again this cycle of violence. Right. One of the things, as a side note, as a related side note, one of the things that most terrifies me about our moment is that you see people saying, after we kick out Donald Trump, we have to have truth and reconciliation commissions. David Hogg, the sort of guy everybody likes to dunk on, but he's a kind of gun control young guy at Harvard. He was saying something like this. You can find other statements like this on Twitter, right? We need to basically have a reckoning after Trump is out. It sounds a lot like this, and this is not the only time in history this has happened, right? That somebody grabs control, wins a civil war, wins a violent conflict between fellow citizens, and then says, and now I'm cleaning house. I'm kicking everybody out. And in terms of Sulla's prescriptions, that meant blood and more blood. And this is Plutarch, whom we've cited before. He's this kind of very vivid historian and biographer of Rome. He says in his biography of Sulla, he says, Sulla now began to make blood flow, and he filled the city with deaths without number or limit. Sulla immediately prescribed 80 persons without communicating with any magistrate. So complete unilateral action. As this caused a general murmur, he let one day pass and then prescribed 220 more, and again on the third day as many. In a harangue to the people, he said, with reference to these measures, that he had prescribed all he could think of, and as to those who now escaped his memory, he would prescribe them at some future time. There's a tremendous arrogance in that, right? There's, I've prescribed everybody. Not only have I prescribed everybody I can think of, but there probably people have escaped my memory, and I'm coming for you. So that's from Plutarch's Life of Sulla, and it tells you what a dark time this was in Roman history. And it also tells you that the office of the dictatorship, like so many other institutions in Rome, is now falling apart. It's being abused. Every office can be abused. Every human institution is imperfect. And if you don't have people in those institutions occupying the roles with virtue, there's no substitute for individual virtue and for people having been trained in the righteous traditions of their polity and of their forefathers. So if you don't have that, then any institution can be twisted out of whack. The Senate had already become decadent, as I've said now at length. The tribunes of the plebs had basically tried to, lead this giant popular uprising. And now we have the dictatorship starting to turn into a tyranny, into people grabbing power and using it basically in vindictive and self-serving ways. So this is all the lead up to the big honcho, the big kahuna, right, Julius Caesar, because we're now getting up to the period at which, and again, something that we will cover in much greater detail later, right, but he did, as Sulla himself had done, he basically gets the army, or as much of the army as he can, to obey him rather than the officers of state. And so it's not Rome anymore that's in charge of the military. It's Julius Caesar, because the army has loyalty to him, and he's this very charismatic, very wise, not wise, but cunning leader, let's say. And his writing on military tactics are incredibly kind of precise and insightful. And he basically becomes the unilateral leader of the military power, which is another thing that really gets me antsy, is when I start to see military leaders, as they often do, speaking out, kind of contending with one another and speaking out against the executive power. You don't want that. You don't want a military that is its own kind of operative power, because the force, in the last analysis, right, where the guns are is where the power is going to be, and so when the military starts to be its own entity, then you have a serious potential for monarchy, empire, tyranny, and in fact worse. And so famously, Caesar crosses the Rubicon in 49 BC. That is, he goes over the river and he basically says, the die is cast. I am now, leading my own faction essentially against Rome. We will cover this period in greater detail later, but suffice it to say that there follows his great nephew Octavian, right? Caesar's great nephew, adoptive heir, and great nephew Octavian, and who will also seize control of both the army and the state. So Caesar's assassinated in 44 BC. There follows everything that we covered with Barry Strauss. You may recall back in episode 3, I think it was, way back in the day, we talked about this power struggle between the various members of the triumvirates and Octavian's eventual victory at the Battle of Actium over his rivals Mark Antony and the famous Cleopatra, right? So that's how Rome finally becomes an empire. Octavian is Rome's first official emperor. He becomes Augustus. So that's how we usually now know him. Augustus Caesar, Augustus ruler, leader of the state. And it's now all pretense has effectively dropped. The people who have been vying for complete political control without totally being able to say that are now, one of them has come out on top, and he puts his cards on the table, and now this is Augustus. Here is Caesar. Rome is an empire. Whew. Take a breath. I will pick up the story in a moment. But first, I will say, as I often do, great to be here. This is so much fun for me to do. Thank you for listening. I love how many people are listening to this show. I love hearing from you about the show. Thanks for making this such a blast, because as you can probably tell, I love nerding out with you guys. Thanks for listening. If you have not already, if this is your first episode or you just haven't gotten around to it, subscribe to this show wherever you get your podcasts. You can do it on Apple Podcasts. You can do it on Google Play and Stitcher, wherever. It doesn't matter. Just, subscribe so you get new episodes every week, right? Well, I'll produce one episode a week, and that will be delivered straight to you. And then there are some ways that you can really help us. This show is growing like wildfire, which is awesome. And I would love your help in making that happen, because it's really a kind of a grassroots movement. It's a groundswell, right? And I so appreciate that. If you can leave a 5-star review on iTunes, that really helps. And then if you can let people know about the show wherever you are, on Twitter or on Facebook, and give me a shout out. Let me know that you're listening, because I can't always respond to everybody. I love hearing about people watching and listening to the show. All right. Thanks for being here. Subscribe, leave a review. Let's get back into this story of where Rome is at this point. So the dust settles, right, from this incredibly tumultuous period that I've just described in a bit of a whirlwind, right? We've just gone through 100 years of history of civil unrest in 15 minutes, which, that's bang for your buck, right? But okay, so now the dust settles, and once once you've done that, once you've opened this box of letting civil tensions evolve into physical violence, as we are flirting with doing right now. I mean, by taking to the streets with weaponry, as we are now doing in, the riots that followed George Floyd's death, when you do that, you are flirting with with crossing the Rubicon, to use a cliche, right? You are flirting with a bridge that you can't go back over. It's the point of no return. And once that happens, then everything changes. You really have to how do you live together after that is kind of the question that the Romans were now faced with, right? How do you form something stable? Because that's all politics is in the end. It's how do we live together in a structured way that doesn't lead us to fear constant violence and upheaval? How do you create a scenario in which people can build lives that have rules, predictable rules to them? Because the world outside has, it has the predictable rules in the sense of the laws of nature, but there's no, it's human beings who build civilizations, and the point of civilizations as in fact, I think Machiavelli is kind of good at, we'll talk later about Machiavelli, is good at observing this, right? The point of building a government, as he said, is mantenere lo Stato, to keep things in line. Now, Augustus was very good at this. And this is something, because we're Americans and because we hate monarchy, as the Romans did for a long time, right? Because they kicked their kings out to build their republic. We also kicked a king out, and we hate monarchy. We hate rule by one man. And anytime anybody starts talking about it, an empire, we immediately think empire equals bad. And I have that intuition as much as the next guy. I want to live in a republic. That's what I want. That's what I think is the best form of government. It's the one described in the Constitution, and I will, as they say, die on that hill. However, it's important, I think, for thinking about the past to let your mind for a second put aside your own native attachments. And what I mean by that is, given the period that I am living in and the way that I grew up and the values that I was taught, which I believe to be true and objectively true and universal, right? Given that, what I think is that a republic is the best way to govern, and that a free people is the kind of populace that you want. You have to train that, and you have to build that up. The past is another country, and people have lived in a million different ways that are not like ours. And actually ours, we don't really recognize it anymore. Ours in America is very rare. It's very rare to live the way that we do. And in order to really get the wisdom that the past has to offer, you have to think your way into the why of people's motivations and how they were looking at the world. And so it's important to understand that, monarchy was not a bad word. I mean, tyranny had become a bad word. And the Greeks, of course, were famous for having, the Athenians really, were famous for having made the case spectacularly for democracy and for, obedience to the law. And that is a good thing. But there are, and this is one of the reasons that we're bad at arguing against tyranny in this country, is we've forgotten that there are actually benefits to monarchy. Monarchy has a lot of benefits, and stability, if you have a monarch who is really in control, stability is one of the benefits. And I think the Romans were starved for stability at this point. And there's a lot to be said in this moment for the Augustan peace, it's called, right? The peace of Augustus. And this idea that a competent and clement, he was very good at representing himself as kind of merciful by comparison to people like Sulla, right? That he was not going to bring fire and sword because he knew that was an unstable way of governing, but instead he was going to be clement to his enemies. And of course, this was in some respect propaganda because he had an iron fist on the state. But there was the Roman people were at a point where leadership by an emperor made a lot of sense and was good for a lot of people, as in the sense of they probably, the people that were on the right side flourished, and art flourished. This is another thing that is really hard for us to grapple with, because we have to acknowledge the temptations that monarchy and rulership by one person offers in order to argue against it, right? Because what we argue, we who love freedom, right? We who wish to be self-governed are arguing not that we will always have the most money if we're free, or the most, opulent society if we're free. That's not our case for freedom. It's not always true. Monarchy can be very efficient and can be very generative of wealth, and it can foster a lot of art, as we're about to discuss. Our argument is that freedom is better, that we would rather have a scrappy, free republic than we would have a sprawling imperial, dictatorship, essentially. And we have to remember that when we're arguing for freedom, when we're fighting for freedom. It may become very important in the years to come. Having said that, the Augustan period is famous for a shocking flourishing of art. It's really Rome's golden age, and it's been called that many times. It's Rome's golden age of culture. And it's comparable, we've talked about this before, it's comparable to Greece's victory over Persia and the following sort of just bloom of Athenian thought and art that happened in this Athenian golden age. The Augustan era is like that. You get Rome's really greatest historian, Livy, who chronicles the development of the Republic and the out of the monarchy into the Republic and the vast history of Rome. You get Propertius, Horace, Ovid, Virgil, these poets, yeah. And Virgil, of course, is really probably the most famous of them, although you've probably heard all of those names. You have these, a lot of it happens through patronage, which is rather, a sort of famous way for this sort of thing to go down. We have discovered, in archaeological digs, we've discovered this villa where a lot of these guys hung out. And Virgil was one of the people, the composer, the writer of the Aeneid. Virgil is one of the people who would hang out at the villa of Calpurnius Piso or Piso. Sometimes it depends how you pronounce Latin and English. But this villa, it's called the Villa of the Papyri because it contains this vast library of all this stuff. Unfortunately, it's in Herculaneum, so it was buried under all this ash when Vesuvius erupted. And a lot of the books still survive, and there's this incredible kind of technological effort going on to uncover them and X-ray them and do all this stuff. If you've ever been to the Getty Villa out here in California, it's modeled after this Villa of the Papyri. And so this is a culture really of, you wouldn't call it decadent, really. You would call it luxurious support for the art. And it was good for people that got in the good graces of the emperor. And you're going to start to see this in the history of Rome now after this. It starts to become all about imperial patronage, which again is another good argument against this kind of thing, is that it doesn't actually lead to universal flourishing. It leads to flourishing for the guys that the empire likes. For the guys that the people in charge don't like, e.g., for example, Cicero, it doesn't turn out so well. But that's a story for another day. I've told that story actually already on this podcast once or twice. Augustus was not in favor of what you would call free speech in any meaningful sense of the term. And that's another thing, again, that those of us who love freedom will be sad to hear, right? One thing that he was famous for having done is exiling Ovid. Ovid was this great poet of kind of sex and mythology, and he wrote the Metamorphoses, which are these stories of transformation, but also the Ars Amatoria, the art of love. And it was said, it's a little unclear what the circumstances were around Ovid's exile, but he says it's because of a poem and a mistake. And so we sort of think it's because he was basically too sexy for the Augustan reign, which was one known for sort of encouraging moral probity. And that was part of the kind of orderedness of the reign. And it's thought that perhaps Ovid slept around with members of Augustus' family. It's also thought, of course, that the sauciness of his poetry was too much for this regime to handle. And so, this is not an era where you can say anything that you want. And that's going to be important. It's going to figure into our discussion of Virgil and of the Aeneid. But what's true is that Augustus was wise when it came to art. He was shrewd about its role in civilization. This is something that conservatives are constantly lamenting they didn't figure out in time, the cultural power that art has. And of course, this was a bit of Greek wisdom, really. Plato knew that the poets were able to shape the hearts and souls of the citizenry in ways that logic and reason never could, because much of poetry, much of art is pre-rational or sub-rational. It's got this way of infiltrating itself into your soul that, even if you don't agree with the values of a Hollywood movie, you might still go, right? And not only will you still go, but when you go, you'll be shaped in a certain direction, because certain things will be portrayed as beautiful and certain things will be portrayed as ugly, and that will teach your heart to love and to hate certain things. And Augustus knew this. He understood it, and he had this kind of cultural minister, Maecenas. That's a bit of an anachronism to call him that, but he was the guy that Augustus trusted to foster artistic talent and therefore win it over to the Augustan regime. And what's intriguing is that some of these guys, Virgil, for example, seems to have hung out with Epicureans. And there's some sense that, people have tried to argue that maybe Epicureanism was a philosophy behind the Aeneid. I think that there's some argument to be made for that. But one thing to note is that Epicurus was famous for having deplored teaching through poetry and wanting to kind of exile Homer from the schools and all this stuff. But Augustus was not like that. He was more shrewd. And he got Maecenas to befriend both Virgil and Horace, which is two of the leading literary lights of the day. Really the two, the ones who would become greatest in posterity. And that's the context in which the Aeneid is written. So now we have enough understanding of kind of what's going on to see what Virgil's doing with the Aeneid, right? It's written. Bits of it were probably read aloud to Augustus. It was the great masterwork of Virgil's life. He wrote many other poems that we still have, the Georgics, for example. But he probably, he left it at least a little bit unfinished, the Aeneid. In 19 BC, when Virgil, died, there were at least lines of verse that weren't complete. And we'll talk in a bit about the question whether the whole poem is actually unfinished, incomplete. But the key thing really to know is that you have two different operators here. You have Augustus and you have Virgil. And their goals there's like a Venn diagram where their goals overlap, but they're not necessarily the same. Virgil is a poet, right? He wants to make his name as an artist. He wants to create great works, especially, I think, he has a fair amount of ambition to outdo Homer, as we'll discuss further. But he's not the same guy as Augustus, whose job is to keep order, who wants to maintain his own power and also the peace of Rome. For Virgil, the challenge is write a Roman epic for this moment, right? Write something that can do for Rome what Homer eventually did for Athens and for Greece more generally, this pan-Hellenic, artifact of cultural triumph, that when you have that, that's a source of great cultural pride, and the Romans were often kind of looking back. At this point, they had conquered Corinth and the, many of the Greek city-states had kind of come under their sway. But there is this, let's say, conflict in the Roman heart between really admiring everything that Greece had achieved in terms of philosophy and poetry and art, right? And also fearing a certain kind of luxuriousness, that these Greeks were these boy lovers, and we talked about this at Plato's Symposium. These Greeks were these boy lovers who, they had let themselves grow soft, and all this art and poetry, what's this all about? And there is a very strong strain of kind of Roman traditionalism, which rejects that as corruption, kind of as this thing that comes across the sea and will soften the manly heart of the Roman soldier and the Roman farmer. Because this idea of Rome having grown out of these, huts and people working the land, and they eventually became this great military power. That idea is very powerful and important for the story of Rome. And to think of themselves basically as the heirs of that tradition is very important. And so there's a certain wariness of Greek artistic achievement, but then there's also this, this Hellenism, this love. Cicero is a good example of somebody that was fascinated by Plato and the Greek philosophers, and really, everyone in Greece. Cicero writes in his Tusculan Disputations. This is book 1, chapter 3. He says, in learning, indeed, and all kinds of literature, Greece did excel us, and it was easy to do so, where there was no competition. For while among the Greeks, the poets were the most ancient speakers species of learned men since Homer and Hesiod lived before the foundation of Rome, and Archilochus was a contemporary of Romulus. Romulus is another kind of founding figure comes after Aeneas, right? We received poetry much later. So they think of themselves as having come late to the party, basically. And Horace famously in his epistles, this is book 2, epistle number 1, Horace says that Greece captured her savage conqueror, that once the Romans started taking over Greek city-states, they became captivated by basically Greek culture and life, and Rome became Hellenized. So Virgil is kind of looking at Greece and trying to figure out what to do with the desire both to outdo Greece, but also to be uniquely Roman, specific to this kind of, again, this spare, hardy virtue. And Rome is trying to recover that because they've just had this seismic transformation, right? That they've gone through this terrible bloodshed, and they're now an empire. They're not a republic anymore, and they have this one leader, and they have to find some way of thinking about themselves as still the same guys, right? As still the same guys that their forefathers were, and really, once you've had that kind of struggle over how your republic or how your civilization is going to continue, you're sort of asking, well, what even are we? And are we any good, right? And this is why that question of the founding becomes so important, right? Are we good? Can we like what we're doing here and endorse the Roman project? And so, this is where Augustus and Virgil overlap, because Virgil, again, wants Rome to have a great cultural achievement. He wants to be the great culture hero of Rome, and Augustus wants a way of telling the story of Rome that will be consistent from the very first days of, under the monarchy, and then, triumphing and becoming this kind of republic, now up to this Augustan moment. Augustus wants that story, a way to tell that story. And so I really think Aeneas is like the answer to that question. He's the perfect guy to slot into, well, how are we going to look back on our history and think of our founding and ourselves as good? Why? Well, I told you the story at the very beginning of this episode about who Aeneas was in the Iliad. He's kind of a second string fighter for Troy. I mean, he's a great hero. I shouldn't downplay him, but he's no Hector, right? He's not the center of the focus on the Trojan side. Remember, Troy was the sort of great civilization in Asia Minor, now Turkey, that the Achaeans, who were eventually the Greeks, were fighting against Troy to get back Helen. And the Trojans in Homer, as we discussed, are noble, right? They are not the kind of evil Eastern enemy. They are these very upright, upstanding, in many ways, kind of more admirable than some of the Greeks. And so there is this kind of great wealth of storytelling that doesn't just go to the credit of the Greeks, but is part of the sort of story of the world. And Aeneas, in that moment in book 20, he's saved from being killed by Achilles, who was a far, far superior warrior to Aeneas and was ready to kill him, but the gods save him because he's destined to keep the line of Troy going. All that talk about keeping the line of Dardanus and the line of Priam alive, right? That's the story that we have about him in the Iliad. And there had been a number of other retellings of this. He comes up again and again, and there are all these tales that after he flees Troy, he makes his way to Italy. So there was already this legend that he founded Lavinium, it's called, in a region called Latium, which is where we get things like Latin, right? The word Latin comes from Latium, and it's to the south of Rome. So it's not actually where Rome eventually will be. But he founds, the story is that he founds this city of Lavinium, and then his son, Silvius, founds Alba Longa, which is another city. And then out of Alba Longa come Romulus and Remus. And Romulus and Remus are the kind of one of the major, two of the major founding figures of Rome. Romulus famously kind of founds Rome for real. And so Rome has sort of its own story about Romulus and Remus, but then they also have this, this kind of story floating around about Aeneas after Troy making his way to Lavinium. And this connects Aeneas first of all, to the agrarian roots of Rome, right? It makes him a kind of image of those very, very first hardy days. Back before the great empire emerged, there was still this kind of virtue of Aeneas. And he's, even in that Iliad passage, but also subsequently, he's known for piety. He's known for respecting the gods and for respecting his family, very urgently respecting his family and his paternal line. And that's, of course, another sort of classic Roman virtue. And then, of course, he's also sort of just Greek enough. And this is, something that is very delicate because, as I said, they have this weird relationship to Greece, and they are now going to be ruling all over the world. And so they want a hero who can kind of come out of Greece, but also represent these uniquely Roman values. And there was a story that is told and retold by Dionysius of Halicarnassus, for example, that the Trojans had originally come from Greece. And so that basically makes Rome Greek at a distance, right? Greek has this Greek history behind it. And that makes it a good candidate to kind of combine all of the best things of the world, the kind of Greek artistic achievement and the Roman military might and the sort of agrarian values and honor, that all of those things are sort of combined into Rome through Aeneas. A central part of the story that long predates Virgil is that Aeneas, when Troy was burning, went back into the wreckage and dragged his father and his son out, and with them the images of his household gods, these kind of, the gods that watch over this particular house, right? And so this is this perfect image. You can see it on vases from Greek vases, from way before Virgil, this image of filial piety. And that image is central to the Aeneid. So let's actually read now some of this great poem. And I'm going to read actually a number of different translations because I've gotten a lot of questions about translation. We talked a little bit about it. Beowulf talked about different translations, but I'd like you to hear all the various, ways that you can work with the same text so that you can kind of know what some of the issues are. So the first one that I'm going to read actually is this fairly recent translation by David Ferry. And one of the things about translating ancient poetry is that it can be done by sort of academic classicists, but also by poets who, might have a background in Latin. Ferry is himself a poet, and I think you can hear that in his work. So what happens is Aeneas tells to Queen Dido, the Queen of Carthage, and we're going to get to her later. He re-narrates that whole story of how he kind of went back. And this was a story that existed, but Virgil kind of dramatizes it in this fantastic way. And so he tells the story about going back as Troy is burning. He says, "In misery I make ready," this is Aeneas speaking, "longing for death, to fight again. For what was else to do? What other chance was left? My father, did you think that I could ever leave you behind? How could a father ever utter such a thought as this? If it is what the gods desire, that nothing survive of what was Troy, and if it is your will to add yourself and yours to the sum of ruin, the gate is open through which the ruin comes. Pyrrhus," this is the son of Achilles who rampages through Troy, "Pyrrhus will soon be here, with Priam's blood still dripping from his sword. Pyrrhus who butchered the son whose father had to watch it done, and then he butchered the father at the altar. Oh, gracious mother, was it for this you saved me, among the swords, among the fires, to see the enemy come into my house, and see Ascanius," this is his son, "and my father and my wife slaughtered here, each in each other's blood? No, the last light remaining to me is a summons. Though we shall die, we shall not die unavenged. I took up my sword once more in my right hand, once more took up my shield on my left arm, and was leaving my house on my way to die in battle. But there on the threshold, my wife was kneeling before me and holding up little Iulus," this is another word for Ascanius, "to show him to me. 'If you are going forth to die,' she cried, 'then take us with you to share what fate might be. But if you have some hope in what your weapons can do, because of what they have done before, then wear your armor to guard this house, your home. For whom are you abandoning your child and your father and her whom you once called your wife?'" So this tremendous melancholy and drama of imagining what it would be like to go back into the city where everything that you ever have known is burning to the ground, and salvaging. What are you going to salvage, right? That's what this image is about. What are you going to carry forth from the old world into the new? And what Aeneas ends up deciding, and this is another thing that brilliantly Virgil imagines this, is like, well, he takes his father and his son and his household gods in the story. But what about his wife? And so Creusa, his wife, basically ends up letting him go. Basically ends up saying, the most important thing is to carry on this paternal line and my son. And that you'll have these 3 generations, and she recedes into the flames. And she basically, lets him, calls him to go on. And at the very end of this story, he encounters her ghost. So I'll read this passage too. He says, "The flames tower high above the burning house, and the heat of the burning pours up into the sky. And so I go on. And once again I see the palace of Priam and the citadel, and in the empty courtyard of Juno's shrine, there's Phoenix and dire Ulysses," right? These are the Greeks, right? "Guarding the treasures taken from everywhere, looting Troy, from the shrines that the Greeks had set fire to, the golden bowls, the holy altar tables, the stolen holy vestments, boys and trembling matrons stand around. I wander in the streets, in my desperation calling her name, Creusa, Creusa, calling Creusa, Creusa over and over again. And as I went among the ruined buildings and through the streets of the ruined city, lo, suddenly there rose before my eyes the strange, magnified image of my wife. I was stupefied. My hair stood on end, my voice caught in my throat. Then she spoke to me and said words that altered everything for me. Beloved husband, what use is it for you to persist in this insanity of grief? What has happened here has happened not without the will of the gods. The high lord of Olympus does not permit Creusa to go with you, to be with you on your journey where you are going. Long exile will be yours, plowing across vast seas until you come to Hesperia, where Lydian Tiber gently flows between rich husbanded fields, and where you will be happy, a king, and wedded to a royal wife." So her ghost basically lets him go. And part of the genius of this poem is that instead of building just a kind of jingoistic, purely triumphalist narrative, the way that Virgil kind of portrays this is as this wrenching, anguished, costly thing to found this civilization. And why is that so important for this moment in Rome? Well, they've just had a wrenching, anguished, costly 100 years. And this picture of this new civilization bought at a terrible cost. And it's inspiring because it tells you, and this is something that we always get wrong. We always think that patriotic literature has to be dumb literature, has to be kind of reductive and stupid. But no, the great patriotic literature, all of it, if you really go to it, is very weird and melancholy. And Virgil includes all of the sort of imagery of melancholy in this poem. And so, so here you get a flavor for kind of what he's doing. He's both acknowledging the pain that Aeneas went through to create something great. And I think, and this is an open question, but I believe arguing that it's worth it. At the very least, he's certainly arguing that it's worth it openly, right? For Augustus, he's arguing, yes, as far as anyone can tell in the ancient world, this is a pro-Augustan poem, and it's designed to, uplift the glory of Rome. Now, we'll get in a moment to why people have thought that maybe that's not the whole picture. But essentially, what we have here is this kind of artistic imagining of of what we hope will be the story that basically justifies Rome in the eyes of this historical moment. So we've talked already a little bit about the kind of relationship with Greece. A brief note about the sort of stylistic way that Virgil manages this. The poem is explicitly a callback to Homer, and it is part of what has already become and will then become this great poetic tradition of poets one-upping each other. You made the Iliad and the Odyssey, each one of them 24 books long. Well, here's the Aeneid, It's 12 books long, and 6 of them, the first 6 are kind of reminding us of the Odyssey, these journeys that Aeneas has to take to get to where he's going, to found what will become Rome. And then the next 6 are all about war. They're about the wars that he has to fight with Turnus and the Rutuli, who are his rivals, basically, for ruling the Italian land where he ends up. And so it's a little Odyssey and a little Iliad, and it kind of claims to outdo them both in some way. It also, it's about, as I said, it's about half the length. So it's 9,869 lines long total. And it has this compactness to it, this kind of force and drive, which I think is very Roman. The Greek as a language in and of itself, the verb forms kind of sprawl out into these big, complicated, lengthy compounds. And Latin has more of this aspiration artistically to kind of spareness and elegance, this kind of, only what is necessary, trimmed down to this perfect driving war machine, essentially. And the poem gallops along as this war machine. The meter is the same. It's dactylic hexameter, and it's dactylic hexameter in Latin. The rules are essentially the same. As I did this for the Iliad, I'll do it also for the Aeneid. So you can read. I'll read it aloud, and you can hear a little bit about of what it sounds like in Latin, and then I'll read the same portion in English. This is the opening of the Aeneid, famous opening. And I'm going to emphasize, this is not, I don't think, quite how you would read it if you were just reading it fluently. I'm going to emphasize the rhythm for you so you can hear how this dactylic hexameter, which remember is da, 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 da. You have these dactyls, da, 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 and then these spondies, 2 long, da, da, and you have 6 of them. So it's hoofbeats and heartbeats, as I always say, right? So, arma virumque cano, Troiae qui primus aboris, Italiam fato profugus la viniaque venit, litora multilet terisiactatus et alto, vi superum saevae memorem unonis obiram, multa quoquet bello passus dum conderet urbem, inferetque Deus latio genusunde Latinum, albanique patres at qualtae moenia Romae. So similar rhythm to the Homer, but different feel, right? Different feel of the language, different feel of the sort of driving beat. Here's our old friend Robert Fagles, whose Iliad I read at the beginning and whom I really love. He's also done an Aeneid. So here's the English version of those first 5 lines. Wars and a man I sing, an exile driven on by fate. He was the first to flee the coast of Troy, destined to reach Lavinian shores and Italian soil. Yet many blows he took on land and sea from the gods above, thanks to cruel Juno's relentless rage, and many losses he bore in battle too, before he could found a city, bring his gods to Latium, source of the Latin race, the Alban lords and the high walls of Rome. Tell me, Muse, how it all began. So there's, you could spend, of course, a whole podcast on just the opening of the thing. And you can hear the way that Fagles is really focused on retaining some of that rhythm, some of those hoofbeats and heartbeats, whereas Ferry's translation is a little bit more naturalistic. It kind of feels a little bit more like you can just read it aloud. There's lots going on here just in the opening, kind of announcing how this poem is going to work. One of the key things is that it begins, as you may have heard this phrase before, it begins in medias res. So you can hear, first of all, the way that the rhythms are similar to those in Greek, but that the Latin really kind of drives on a little bit more and has, I think, a really more muscular feel to it. And then note also that there are both sort of callbacks to Homer here, and then there are ways that it breaks away from Homer. One is that he waits to invoke the muse, and the famous sort of sing muse, main and Aeneid thea, sing the rage, right, is sort of the classic Homeric opener. And this, Virgil kind of waits, and he tells you first about the man. This is the person, the character of this person is the center of the poem. On the other hand, it begins in a famously Homeric way. It begins in medias res. And that's actually Horace, who kind of comes up with that. You may have heard it before. It begins in the middle of things. And the contrast that Horace makes, and this is kind of interesting, we don't note this that much, but in medias res is contrasted in Horace's Ars Poetica, which is the art of poetry. He contrasts it to, in medias res is the opposite of beginning, ab ovo, from the egg. And it's a little joke here on Homer, because Horace says, Homer doesn't begin from the egg, which is the egg from which Helen emerged. She was born out of an egg because her mother Leda was basically, was ravished by Zeus in the form of a swan. And so Helen came out of the egg. She doesn't begin from the egg, but of course, egg also is sort of this image of like the very, very beginning. And so in medias res is the classic Homeric way to begin. And that is exactly what Virgil does. He sort of starts us off with the post-Trojan War moment and then goes back. And the way that he goes back, as I've mentioned already, is by telling the story to Dido, the riveting Carthaginian queen. She's one of the most famous characters from this whole spiel, right? He basically lands desperate and kind of storm-tossed. He lands in Carthage. Dido picks him up. He tells his entire story that I've now already narrated a little bit of it, of escaping from Troy. And they have this love affair. And it's basically directed by the gods, by weird conspiring. So Juno is kind of the great divine antagonist here. She's the wife of, Juno is Hera, right? The Roman name for Hera. And she's the wife of Zeus. She hates Aeneas because she knows that Rome is going to eventually destroy Carthage. And Carthage is this, civilization that Rome had fought deathly, painfully with. And Juno loves Carthage, presides over it. And then, and this is something that we haven't talked about yet, but it's very important, right? Aeneas's mother is Venus. Venus, the goddess of love, Aphrodite in Greek, right? And one of the reasons that's important is because through Aeneas and Venus, Augustus himself can trace his lineage all the way back. He traces it back through Ascanius, back to Aeneas. He believes he's descended from, or at least he presents himself as being descended from, this divine lineage and this kind of heroic founding. Venus and Juno team up to cause this love affair between Aeneas and Dido to happen. Venus wants Aeneas to stay safe, so he wants Dido to kind of be protective over him, and so in love with him. And Juno, of course, wants to sort of stop the founding from happening, doesn't want the future that she knows is coming to proceed. And so they have this kind of clandestine, they get married in a cave, but like not really. There's some question about whether it's official. It's not totally official. It's like hashtag it's complicated between them. And their status on Facebook is like, we're not quite sure. But so they have this tumultuous, passionate love affair. Dido is a widow before she meets Aeneas and is sort of thought she'd never love again. But suddenly she says, I recognize the footsteps of an old flame. I see this coming back to me. And so this is all going on, and suddenly, the gods, the sort of, the gods who are in charge, namely Zeus, i.e. Jove, in Latin, say this can't happen. I mean, we have a whole program here. There's like something that's got to go on. So this intervention of fate via Jove, and Jove sends Mercury or Hermes, the messenger god, to tell Aeneas, you got to go, man. You got to found this thing and stop like hanging around with this like hot chick. So that happens, and Aeneas goes. He follows his destiny. It's a wrenchingly difficult decision and an extremely beautiful, tender, tragic moment when Dido, in fury, finds Aeneas about to leave and makes these accusations against him. And so here is what she says. And this is it must be one of the most famous passages from all of literature. It's inspired a million different, opera. Purcell created the opera Dido and Aeneas. And it's inspired, of course, visual art just to no end. And so here's what she says. She finds him. She assails Aeneas. This is Fagles again. She assails Aeneas before he said a word. So, you traitor, you really believed you'd keep this a secret, this great outrage, steal away in silence from my shores. Can nothing hold you back? Not our love, not the pledge once sealed with our right hands, not even the thought of Dido doomed to a cruel death. Why labor to rig your fleet when the winter's raw, to risk the deep and the north winds closing in, you cruel, heartless, even if you were not pursuing alien fields, and unknown homes. Even if ancient Troy were standing, still, who'd sail for Troy across such heaving seas? You're running away from me? Oh, I pray you by these tears, by the faith in your right hand, what else have I left myself in all my pain? So this is wrenching because you see the different reasoning that she goes through in each, like moment by moment, she switches reasons. Well, you can't sail now. It's winter. Well, you made a promise. Well, and of course, this is just this terrible desperation in the face of, inexorable fate. And finally, all she's left with is her pain. She's left with her tears. And here is what Aeneas says in response. He says, you have done me so many kindnesses, and you could count them all. I shall never deny what you deserve, my queen, never regret my memories of Dido, not while I can recall myself and draw the breath of life. I'll state my case in a few words. I never dreamed I'd keep my flight a secret. Don't imagine that. Nor did I once extend a bridegroom's torch or enter into a marriage pact with you. If the fates had left me free to live my life, to arrange my own affairs of my own free will, Troy is the city, first of all, that I'd safeguard. Troy and all that's left of my people whom I cherish. The grand palace of Priam would stand once more. With my own hands, I would fortify a second Troy to house my Trojans in defeat. But now Apollo's oracle says that I must seize on Italy's noble land. His Lycian lots say, Italy. There lies my love. There lies my homeland now. If you, a Phoenician, fix your eyes on Carthage, a Libyan stronghold, tell me, why do you grudge the Trojans their new homes on Italian soil? What is the crime if we seek far-off kingdoms too? So it's what's really wise and sort of powerful about this moment is it's this uniquely human drama between this woman who's been very wronged and this man who has to make a hard choice to do, at all costs to do what he must, even though, if he had his choice, he says, it's not of my will that I head for Italy. I would rather not. And then, but of course it's also a drama between two civilizations. It's Rome and Carthage standing against one another. Why do you, Carthage, begrudge us expansion? Why do you begrudge us more? And so this is where, this kind of, let's say, potential immorality, right? It's an open question whether what Aeneas should do, and so people have started to look to this and to the melancholy of it, especially in America. Really, it's really in antiquity it was just everybody sort of thought this is a pro-Augustan poem, but in America people started to say, well, gosh, is this kind of hinting at the fact that empire is actually bad, the fact that Rome has essentially betrayed itself. And one argument that people make is that Dido is basically Cleopatra. Then basically Aeneas has a choice whether to be Antony, whether to act like Mark Antony, Augustus' rival, who indulged his love for Cleopatra and, loved her till the end, till they died, or whether he's going to be the ruthless Octavian, the ruthless Augustus, who fought against and destroyed, who broke the power of Antony and Cleopatra. And basically Aeneas makes the Octavian choice. He makes the choice of, my duty to the gods and my duty to the future is greater than any personal attachment I might have. And we have to sort of, kind of wrestle with whether we condone this choice. I still believe that we're meant to. So what's called the pessimistic reading is that this is a criticism, that many of these things are criticisms of Augustus, as ruthless, as bloody, of empire as this kind of founded on blood, basically. And I sort of think that what's genius about the poem is that it acknowledges all of these terrible costs to founding a great civilization, at the same time as it says, but you know what? It's worth, this is what you have to do. And this was, as I say, this was kind of the reading in antiquity. In modernity, because, we hate empire and because we've seen such terrible, in the 20th century, we saw such terrible excesses of nationalism and patriotism. We began to wonder, whether it was all worth it. And we began to become very angsty about, there are many passages in the Aeneid that just say, and especially in book 6, Aeneas goes down to the underworld and sort of sees the future of Rome, and the future of Augustus is predicted. And it just says, he's going to go forth and crush the proud, battle down the proud enemies that he has, and subdue the earth. And we kind of look at that and we think, gosh, can this possibly be an endorsement? I think that in the world of antiquity, where stability meant so much, and life otherwise was likely to be nasty, poor, brutish, and short, I think that there would hardly have been a question for a Roman whether that was an object of the utmost importance to achieve this civilizational glory. And there is a very, very famous passage that I will now read my own translation, just again to give you kind of more comparison. There's a very famous passage where he basically, I think, says this, and this is after Anchises, Aeneas' father, has died. He meets him in the underworld, and Anchises says, "Others will hammer breathing bronze more deftly and coax faces out of marble. I don't doubt it. Some will plead court cases better and trace the movements of the heavens with a pointer, predict the rising of the stars. But you, remember, rule the peoples with authority, Roman. These are your arts, to impose the ways of peace, to spare the conquered, and to crush the proud." This is what the Romans are learning to see themselves as, that as they sort of expand outward, as they turn into something new, they have to find some way of being proud of themselves. And this is, a pretty fair way for them to do it. Virgil is kind of saying, be at peace with this. Yes, the Greeks, better astronomers, better philosophers, that all of this kind of fancy stuff that other civilizations can do. He's saying, you Romans, this is a hard thing. It's not a thing that's going to make you, beloved by all. And it's not something that it was going to come without terrible personal cost. But you are the civilization builders of the world. And this is, I think, really what Virgil is doing here. He's basically putting into Aeneas all of the pain and all of the glory that comes with Rome's current cultural moment. Now, leave aside for a second whether whatever your opinions are of Augustan Rome and of the idea of empire, right? It's urgent for a civilization to be at peace with itself. It's urgent to have this way of telling your story. And this is why I get so down on the 1619 project, right? It's not that the thing is it's not about facts. And again, as I said, Hannah Jones has said this. She's said, I'm writing this thing not as a history, but she says as an act of journalism. I think it's an act of narrative, right? It's going to take the American founding, which was this providential, larger than life moment, this incredible miracle that these brilliant statesmen founded what would become the freest nation, the light of the world, really, the freest nation on earth. And she takes that and says, well, but it wasn't perfect. And there was slavery, which of course was this terrible moral stain on the country. And because of that, she's telling us the story as if that were the whole story. And this is why when people like, when Trump, for example, does this, he has this commission for patriotic education. That is so crucial, that to look back on your founding. And in our case, I have full confidence it's a true story. When Trump stands in front of Mount Rushmore for a 4th of July speech, and he tells us that this is a great nation, that's the truth. That's the true story. It's so crucial. The reason that we're all at each other's throats right now is because that story is under attack. And when that story is under attack, it's not just that you lose the story that you were told in history class as a kid. It's that you lose your sense of yourself as part of a great experiment, as part of a great endeavor. And so the reason that the Times and Nicole Hannah-Jones are going after the founding is for that reason, that they know that that's how to unmake the country. She said proudly that the riots in the streets are her riots. They're the 1619 riots. And so this, and I turn to Virgil now as a contrast, the kind of flip side of that, right? Because what Virgil is doing is he's taking that all of that darkness and pain that is in history. All human history is sinful. All human history is tragic and flawed. And he's saying, and yet, look what emerged. Look what came out of it. There's a moment at the end that this is the last bit I'll read. And I'll read now from a new translation by Len Krisek, which is rhyming. So it's kind of a different take on the whole thing. It makes it more of expressly a poem. At the end, when Aeneas had to fight to found his city, he faces his rival Turnus, and Turnus begs for mercy. And it's unclear whether this is supposed to be the end or not. But what happens is Aeneas sees the armor that Turnus is wearing. It's kind of a quotation or like an imitation of the relationship between Achilles and Patroclus. And so Aeneas had Pallas, this ward whom he loved, whom Turnus has killed, and he sees the armor that Turnus is wearing. And he says, Aeneas stands armored, fierce, with glinting eyes. He holds back, swayed by Turnus more and more, moved by the speech he's made, till he detects young Pallas' luckless sword belt, stone-bossed, shoulder high on Turnus, and to all well known. So Turnus wears the baldric of his now dead foe, the man he wounded, drove to earth, and there laid low. But when his eyes fix on that spoil, that memory of cruel grief, Aeneas burns ferociously. Shall you escape me in the spoils of someone who was mine? It's Pallas sacrificing you with this, with your own guilty blood. Now you will pay. And as he speaks, he drives his sword in all the way, till Turnus' chill limbs slacken at the lethal blow. Groaning, his bitter soul fled to the shades below. Virgil leaves us with this. And I'm not going to try to resolve whether there was meant to be more, and then when Virgil died, maybe it was he meant to add more. But people have used this to say, well, this shows that empire is evil, that it's all just bloodshed. But I don't think that's right at all. I think that this is a complete picture. And it's not pro or anti-Augustan exactly. It's a complete picture of who Rome is and where she came from and what it means in a world of bloodshed, as the ancient world was, what it means, what the cost is of making peace. That story, telling the story of your founding in a way that you can be proud of, is the only way that a nation can survive. And so it's why conservatives have to pay attention to things like the 1619 Project and do everything they can to tell the great story of our founding. Because we're not even, thank God, we're not even at the point of Rome when it had its empire, right? We are still have this fragile, this precious republic. So few such things have ever existed in the history of mankind. And to pretend that its founding was a work of evil is to try and unmake the greatest thing on earth. So it is my firm and passionate wish that we not let that happen. All right, that's the Aeneid and its relationship to us and to Rome. Let's do the mailbag. I have a bunch of great mailbag questions. These also often come to me through Twitter, so that's where I'm going to read them off. Now, if you have mailbag questions, a great way to do it is just to tweet them at me with #YoungHeretics. And so I would like to answer a question here that I really find interesting, that is important for this very topic. Quattro Jones, at Quattro Jones on Twitter, says, how do we reconcile the clear injustices of the feudal system with the amazing works and culture, specifically ours, that rose out of it? So he's talking here about feudalism, which is not an ancient thing. It's just before the Renaissance. You have this long kind of period sort of throughout the early Middle Ages, and in some cases, even on after that. In Russia, for a long time, you have sort of feudal system, which gives you these feudal lords, and then these serfs, these peasants that work for them. And so he's saying, look, this period produces so much. Feudalist societies, rather. It's not a period so much as a kind of society. And feudalist societies, we deplore them, but they produce things. This is exactly the complexity that I was talking about. I was talking, earlier about the fact that Augustan Rome was the golden age of Rome for art. The reason is that if the pitch that we're making for freedom is that it produces stuff, that it will give us wealth, or it will give us, good art, or it will give us fancy, I do believe that eventually free societies produce great things. And of course, America has produced more wealth for more people and more freedom for more people than any other nation in the world. But that can't be the reason why. This is a crucial distinction. There are positive byproducts of republics, but republics are not the only things that can produce positive byproducts. So look, people are fond of saying that in dictatorships, the trains run on time, and that there are things that are good that people like, let's say, about having a kind of big government daddy to take care of them, right? And this is in the book of Exodus, when the people say, they've been freed from slavery by God through Moses, and they say, we wish that we had died in Egypt when we were slaves, because then at least we had food and drink, right? So people, there are things that people can get out of even the most corrupt arrangement. So our argument for republicanism and freedom can't be that it produces good things. There are other ways to produce good things. Our argument is that freedom is a good per se, that true republican liberty, which is liberty under the laws, not pure licentiousness, not just do whatever you want, but a society governed by the rule of law is ennobling, and your virtue and your nobility are allowed to flourish in that society. And yes, will you get all the good stuff after? Absolutely. Will that produce a flourishing of art? Of course. There's plenty of great examples of Republican society. Florence is a great example of Republican societies that produce great stuff. It's not about that. It's about the fact that great stuff comes in from all kinds of government. But the reason to be free is because it is what you were made to be. I hope that answers the question, and I believe it very firmly. All right. That's the end. If you like this show, as always, go ahead and check out the Claremont Institute where I work. They are very, very gracious to let me do this passion project. And the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind are two wonderful publications that I work for. It's a great time to be donating. And if you do go to claremont.org/donate, say in the notes that you found Claremont through Young Heretics. That will make me very happy. And thanks again so much for being with us. We will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.